Thanks everybody and welcome back for this afternoon session. Before we start, I'd like to introduce my two fellow panelists who are here and also two panelists who will be joining us remotely. Eliza Easton, who's the head of policy unit at the PEC, the Policy and Evidence Centre in the UK, which is the sponsoring body for our International Council, and Tita Larasati from the Institute of Technology in Bandung, one of the leading figures in the Indonesian Creative Cities Network and a powerhouse in thinking about how Indonesia's approaching its year as president of the G20 next year. So this session is billed as talking about an 11 action point agenda, which we've developed in the International Council over the last few months. But before talking about that, I'd just like to start by saying it's normal in these circumstances to say what a pleasure and a privilege it is to be at an event like this. But I thought that the two speeches we had at the beginning of the day today, it really was a pleasure and a privilege to listen to them. Both really powerful, brave, bold speeches by Audrey Azoulay and Her Excellency Noura El-Kadi. And both of them, in talking about the creative economy and the creative industries, we're talking about this strange mixture of resilience and fragility, which we've seen highlighted by the pandemic. And I think all of us who are here understand the resilience of the creative industries and culture because it is so deeply embedded in our societies. And we've seen that during the pandemic, when the economic infrastructure has begun to creak, it's the cultural infrastructure, the human infrastructure that's held society together. But what we've been focusing on in our International Council, and I'll explain a little bit about that in a moment, is the other side, of the fragility. Why is it that although we have here a government in the UAE, which is very actively promoting the creative economy, the government in Colombia, the government in Indonesia, other governments around the world, the fact of the matter is they are still the outliers. This is not yet part of the global mainstream. And there's all kinds of reasons why that should be the case. But one of the reasons is that although the creative sector includes some of the most big and powerful corporations in the world, the creativity, as we've been talking about this morning, is very often driven by lone individuals, by small micro businesses, by informal working arrangements, informal finance arrangements, rapidly changing technology, a whole economy which is based on the value of ideas rather than products. Now, all these are things which governments and the banking sector fundamentally distrust and dislike. That is the problem that we're trying to address. And in thinking about this in our International Council, we've been looking at how we can build on some of the existing good practice that's going on in the world to address some of these issues of how do we address the fragility of the sector and bring it into the mainstream of the global economy so that in a few years' time, an event like this will really be seen to be part of the mainstream economic activity of the world and not something which is, let's be frank about it, is still seen as a little bit on the fringes of culture. Now, I don't know if up on the screen there is the QR code which would link you to our 11 action points, but I hope you'll have a look at them. And in our discussion today, rather than plowing through all 11 action points, I'd encourage you to have a look at that agenda. But we're going to talk about some of them in a little bit more detail and then have a general discussion with all our panelists at the end. But I'd like to start by asking Eliza to say a little bit about some of the international policy repercussions and implications that we've been thinking of in our panel.
Thanks.
Eliza.
Oh, shot myself, sorry. Thanks, John. And yeah, thank you so much for having us and allowing us to launch our agenda at this amazing event. I wanted to start telling a story which I think to some extent indicates the point that John made. So a few years ago, I took an economics diploma. My job actually requires quite a lot of economics, and I wanted to be able to speak the same language as the economists that I worked with. And we did weeks and weeks on the manufacturing sector. And I was waiting to get to the creative industries, thinking, here's an area that I actually know about. And at last, we got to a page which talked about the cultural and creative sector. And our professor said to me, and said to the class, yeah, this area of the economy actually works a bit differently, and we don't actually need to study this for the exam. So let's skip over this page, and if we have time, we'll come back to it later. And we never returned to those pages. And I think for me, it really highlighted that undeniable fact that almost wherever you are in the world, even those places that are the most ambitious about the creative and cultural sector, it is fundamentally downplayed. And we know that's the truth, not just at the national level, but at the international level, not just with policymakers, but with academics and with journalists. So in the UK, that's one of the reasons the Creative Industries Policy and Evidence Centre was set up. We call it the PEC. We're funded as part of the government's industrial strategy ambitions through the Arts and Humanities Research Council, and made up of a consortium of 10 universities led by Nesta, which is my sort of home organisation. And we're really founded on an ambition to improve the evidence base when it comes to the creative industries. We've heard a lot about evidence already here today, but we need to make some jumps in areas from trade to rural investment, from diversity to the future of broadcasting. I think if we want to be taken as seriously as we need to be, and if traditional academic sectors, including that economics professor, a really respected economics professor, don't take interest, then we need to do that research ourselves. And that's to make sure that policymakers and academics understand the heft and the needs of this sector. We knew from the very beginning of the Policy and Evidence Centre, or the PEC, that there was no point thinking about issues only from the national level. And that actually we have to be thinking in terms of international policy. And why is that the case? Why has the sector been left out, and why do we need to think internationally? I'm just going to give a couple of examples before handing over to our amazing council members. First, the creative industries globally are overwhelmingly made up of freelancers and micro businesses, as John outlined. And in the UK, 1 in 3 people working in the creative industries is self-employed. And I have every expectation, speaking to colleagues, that that figure is going to be the same or larger in many nations around the world. And through the Council's discussions over a number of years, we have heard again and again how that group in particular is not being represented at the local, the national, or the international level. They've got limited protections, they're being overlooked in key policy areas. I never stop talking about the fact we don't have a migration system in the UK which works for freelancers, but you can actually talk about almost any policy area, and you see that. Globally, the sector also has many people in it who are part of the informal economy, and that means they're not registered as workers at all. If we're really serious with the Sustainable Development Goals about lifting people out of poverty and promoting equality, then no strategy, international or national, can continue to ignore individuals, whether the person in question is an unregistered designer in Thailand or a freelance craftsperson in the UK. Second, we fundamentally believe that the sector is absolutely core to solving other global issues. For example, those relating to climate. Fashion might be a polluter, one of the largest water polluters in the world at the moment, but the most innovative brands are finding solutions to that level of pollution. We know designers and architects are core to changing the way we live and promoting sustainability. The arts, the film sector, advertising, they've all got some hurdles to get to net zero, as does the software sector, but they're also going to be really important, unlike the software sector, in sending out the messages which get us to net zero. So how does that feed into the more practical asks that we have in our agenda? Well, you may know that the definition of research and development is an international definition and doesn't include some of the content that we think is important and worthy of support in the creative industries. If we want our fashion brands, if we want our TV companies, if we want our film companies to be more innovative, to be addressing net zero questions, we're going to need to start talking about changing that definition at the international level. So those are a couple of examples. You're going to hear more depth and more examples from other panelists, but I hope listening to us, you understand why this global agenda, which really is the first of its kind, is so important. It's now been formally launched and it's been presented to UNCTAD and UNESCO. But I really hope that you can help us to share it and to help people who don't see it yet to understand that this year is the year for the creative economy to come out of the shadows. Thanks.
Thanks, Eliza. Those of you who were in the connection stage session earlier on today, where there was conversation about whose responsibility is to build the creative and cultural sector, and the general agreement seemed to be it's a division between governments nationally and internationally who need to be setting regulation, setting some new rules and parameters. It's also the job of the financial sector, of course. And our next speaker, another member of our panel, is Laura Callanan, who's in New York. Laura was the deputy chair of the National Endowment for the Arts in the US, and then co-founded an organization called Upstart Collab, which is one of the leading investors in impact investment in the US and internationally. And Laura's been leading the charge in drawing attention to the fact that actually a huge amount of money goes into this sector, but it is not still seen as a regular part of the investment world for most of the banking and financial sector. So Laura, if you're there, we'd like to hear from you now.
John, hello. I'm so happy to be able to join you. Greetings from New York City. Sorry to be not in person, but happy to join you virtually today. As John says, I'm Laura Callanan. I'm the founding partner of Upstart Collab. Upstart is connecting impact investing with the creative economy with a focus in the United States. We believe that impact investing can be a very important new source of alternative finance for cultural and creative industries, and that impact investing can complement government funding for creative industries and philanthropic support for arts and culture. So what is impact investing? Impact investing is investing. It's proper investing. It's not philanthropic support. It's not government funding, but it's investing that is trying to do more than simply make money. Impact investors are looking for a substantial financial return, but alongside that, they are also looking to drive social and environmental impact. Paying attention to the welfare of workers, the community, and the planet helps to manage material non-financial risks that affect a company's bottom line and an investor's risk-adjusted rate of return. As John mentioned, impact investing assets are massive. $31 trillion globally is now invested in a way that's socially responsible and driving impact. Impact investing has become mainstream, and in response to client demand, the leading global financial firms, and that includes BlackRock and Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley and JP Morgan and UBS and many more, these major financial institutions now field expert impact advisory teams, and they offer their clients impact investment funds. The idea of profit with purpose has become the standard for good business and for good investing. There are many synergies between what impact investors look for and what investment in the creative economy can deliver. This includes quality jobs, wealth building for women and disadvantaged groups, vibrant communities, and as Eliza was describing, environmentally sustainable production and consumption. Impact investors are looking for opportunities to invest for optimal financial return plus social and environmental impact. So why would they overlook the 10% of our global economy that is the creative economy? In truth, impact investors have been investing in creative industries, but they've been doing it without realizing it. And so now we need to draw their attention so that they can bring more capital to the creative economy and do it on purpose. According to Deloitte, 1/3 of art collectors and art professionals are already asking for impact investing products connected to creativity and culture. So we must respond to this demand with opportunities to invest in the creative economy. In the United States, where I work, and in many parts of the world, the impact investing infrastructure is already in place, and it's up to the creative economy to begin to truly use it. In the US context, the impact investing infrastructure includes investment crowdfunding, community development tax credits, funds and notes, a government endorsement to pension funds to consider the environment, society, and good governance when making investment decisions. My organization, Upstart Collab, is preparing to launch the very first impact investing strategy for the American creative economy. We plan to provide access to capital to diverse entrepreneurs, to support sustainable creative lives, and to grow an inclusive creative economy. While we don't have that yet in the United States, happily, there are already funds in the UK, Europe, Africa, and Latin America that are leading the way for what impact investing in the creative economy can be. And so I'll quickly end by sharing some examples. In the UK, Nesta's Arts and Culture Finance Fund is supporting revenue-generating businesses and cultural activities, and they've been doing it for the last 8 years. In Europe, the impact investing firm Mirabeau offers a living heritage fund that invests in European artisan and traditional craft businesses. In Kenya, the HIVA Fund is investing in fashion, design, film and TV, and video games as part of an East African economic development strategy. And in Brazil, TRE has begun to bring integrated capital solutions to sustainable fashion. John, thank you very much for the opportunity to join virtually. That concludes my remarks.
Laura, thank you. I think that reminds us of the fact that when we talk about the creative economy, we very often prefer to chat about creative rather than economy. And it is a creative economy. But I'm now going to ask Tisa Larasati from Bandung Institute of Technology to talk a bit about, in a way, the more creative side of it, because I think Indonesia, and particularly Bandung, has been a real pioneer in thinking about creative cities and creative communities as part of the necessary infrastructure for not just the culture activity to survive, but for the economic dimension to prosper as well. So Tisa.
Yeah, thank you, John. Because in one of the 11 key points that we offered today, one of them is having the strong community initiatives as one of the intermediaries between the government, who are the authorities to make policies and facilitations and so on, to the actual actors of creative economy, creative industries, who needs those facilitations and so on. So as John mentioned, I come from Indonesia, and if you see the numbers of Indonesia statistics, 17,000 islands, 700 languages, and so on and so on. And if you see the constellation of the islands, it has always been our challenge is logistics and distribution. So that comes with access of basic services, health, education, and so on. So those are actually the basic challenges that we try to cope with. And then recently, especially during the crisis of pandemic, that's when we try to see where creative economy can actually play a part. And it actually differs in many different kind of islands and cities and regencies, people in remote islands and so on. So it started in Bandung because Bandung is, well, it's a city with 120 something universities, 3 million people. So most of us are either young people learning or young people really just having fun in Bandung. And it grows from that dynamics because these young people, when they gather, then they plan something also for their own wealth and also prosperity. But then their own way, because then they cluster in hobbies, groups, and so on. But then we see more critically that what actually we do in the city is giving messages to the government and to the authorities of how a city can be run better. So we kept creating prototypes of things we want in urban sense. So for example, this is the kind of park we want. This is the kind of bike sharing we want. This is the kind of street that we like to have and so on. We like to have our public space and so on. So, and we never run out of ideas and young people because the campuses are all there. And so therefore we also attempt to make a kind of concept or say find a red thread where we can connect different communities from the grassroots level to the other level and to define or to actually identify the constellation where the government can actually play part and where is our part and the other ones. So we used to have the so-called pentahelix stakeholders of a creative city. So those are the ABCGM, academia, business, communities, government, and media. And at the end of 2020, we add another sector. Now it's hexahelix. So we have the sixth helix, which is we call it aggregator. They can be financial institutions, enablers, incubators, and so on, who actually aggregates all these other elements and to come up with something. So in a way, this is a more flexible entity to be that are able to make changes faster than if you have to wait for the government to do that, because they need a length of time, maybe 1 or 2 years or even more, to make policies, to make it fit with the current situation and so on. And most often that it's too late, because if you see digital technology, now NFT and so on, the government has no time to regulate everything. So that's why we are helping it we are helping to set it in our own way and so on. And we've also been communicating within PEC about this indexing of creative city, that it's not only about transaction, e-commerce and so on, but creative economy is more about ecosystem that also cares about the creator, the creative people, and then there's the creative products, system and services, and then there's this marketplace users, anyone who appreciates the work, and then there's this R&D. So within this circle, then we can see where we can contribute in this. So creative city doesn't mean I'm creative and you're not, or I'm creative in this and you're not, but actually it is within this constellation of ecosystem where everyone should play the part. So that's why we are building up this dashboard of creative city index that can be a tool used by local government to make policies and regulations based on the real-time economy, creative economy.
in great megacities all across the southern hemisphere. So one of the pieces of work we did in preparation for this 11-point agenda was to look at what had happened with informal work in the creative and cultural sector during the pandemic. And in doing that, of course, we're touching on the fact that in a way the creative economy is a paradigm for a different kind of shift in the global economy. Always dangerous to use a term like a new paradigm. But if you think about the extent of the growth of informal work, of gig, casualized, freelance work, partly as a result of neoliberal policies being pursued by governments all over the world, partly because the access of digital technology allows people to work in such fundamentally different ways, then in thinking about some of these things, we touch on points which are not just of significance for the creative industries, but are of significance for the whole of the global economy in the 21st century. So the final speaker I'd like to introduce is Avril Joffe, who is in the School of Arts at Witwatersrand University in Johannesburg, and was helping in leading the work that we were doing on informality and its consequences, and some of the things that we, as people who can influence governments and influence civil society, should be thinking about, because that is where the fragility of the creative sector was revealed at its starkest during the pandemic. So, Avril.
Thank you very much, John, and it's really wonderful to be here. Like everybody else, it's a great honor to be with you, even if it's virtual for the moment. So our global agenda, as John has mentioned, indicates a number of areas where informality underpins the agenda. And it's directly linked to actually agenda number 3 when you read it, which is about creative careers, freelancers, and informal livelihoods. But it also underpins agenda number 2, which is about entrepreneurship, agenda number 5, which is about the digital economy, 7, which is about cities, 8, which is about finance, and 9, which is about social equity. So I will encourage you all to have a read of the agenda. It's very short, and it's deliberately short, But underpinning that is this work that we did in the International Advisory Council with members of the council, looking at how informality was being understood by the creatives and creative practitioners, from music, fashion, script writers, photographers, designers, and many others. And really what we came to understand is while there's much written about the informal economy, there's surprisingly little research about the intersection with the cultural economy. Even though in some regions, the informal economy is about 40% of all cultural production. And of an approximately 2 billion people who work informally worldwide, about 93% of them are in the developing countries, with a slightly higher proportion of men than women. And I'll come to that in a sec. In Africa, 95% of youth employment is informal. That's a really, really high percentage. The proportion of total employment that is informal in Asia and the Pacific is 68%. In the Arab states, about 68% as well. In the Americas, 40%. And in Europe and Central Asia, about 25%. The proportion of informality in the culture and creative industries and the creative economy, while a much more prominent feature of emerging and southern economies, is becoming more common in the developed economies, as John said, with the spread of the gig economy, deregulation, increasing practice of outsourcing, contract, flexible, and temporary work. Most of these informal workers, whether in the global south or global north, lack social protection. They lack rights at work. They lack decent working conditions. And this is partly because the culture and creative economy is characterized by small micro enterprises driven by self-employed freelance workers, often working at community level, much of it informal. So governments are not recognizing it. They're not addressing its needs. They're certainly not keeping pace with the rapid evolution of skills and business methods made possible by the ubiquity of digital tech. And so they're not engaging with its full growth potential. And as a result, we say that the state is losing out. But our research at the International Advisory Council has evidenced the extent to which the complexity of formally registering a business, complying with tax, and so on, coupled with a mistrust of officialdom and low-level corruption in many parts of our world, mean that for many workers in our sector, they prefer to be outside the purview of government, which means that they then as well don't have social protection, they don't have access to skills, finance, or growth opportunities. So they also lose out. And in our research, we came up with the importance of things like networks, of relations of trust, of community and family members to access basic finance, to start new operations, the fluidity and politics of space, the intersection of moving in and out of public space, using streets to showcase work, as we heard from my colleague Tita. The fact that many in the informal economy are not understood because they're not documented has led us to think about where could government intervene. And we came up with 7 significant areas, such as better data and definitions, protecting IP, in intellectual property, and meeting compliance standards, the need for public infrastructure to make regulations simple, transparent, and appropriate. But in the interest of time, I'm going to just focus on 3. So firstly, labor relations and social protection. How does one extend basic social protection to informal cultural practitioners? We know that many cultural practitioners are excluded from labor relations and social protection as they don't fall into the definition of employees. So even if a country has very advanced and sophisticated labor relations legislation, as my country does, cultural practitioners are completely excluded from that. They're paid mostly for results on projects rather than time spent. In this way, their work is atypical, it's even marginal, and it can be anything from contract work, freelance, self-employment, own account work, fixed term, part-time. And for many of those, they are in the informal economy. But even for those not in the informal economy, they are also not being protected by basic employee legislation. So the informal freelancers and own account workers often find themselves outside the regulatory mechanisms governing labor relations, decent work, occupational health and safety, maternity benefits, unemployment provisions, or even forms of collective bargaining. But there is some work happening, which is very exciting, to ensure prescribed norms and standards by changing the definition of cultural workers to ensure that they get access to these regulatory protections, such as the one about new status category in the labor statistics called dependent contractor, which captures more accurately the situation of out out workers, home-based workers, and gig workers, as well as those in our sector. In South Africa, there's work being done to include freelancers and own account workers in the definition of employee to at least extend maternity rights and unemployment insurance protection to these workers. The second area is about public procurement. How can the government use its own funding and financing to actually pool the kinds of activities and practices we want to see? It's a major part of a national economy, government purchasing of goods and services, as well as procuring what governments need to fulfill their own functions. The use of public funds for capital and revenue purposes should improve the distribution of income, wealth, and opportunity, and stimulate more creative solutions to meeting public needs. But mostly it favors big contractors, and in many countries is a byword for corruption and inefficiency. A very simple piece of legislation in the UK, the Social Value Act, has allowed local and national authorities to consider a wide range of social, cultural, and environmental factors, as well as price, in negotiating contracts, and coming up with more imaginative and creative solutions, and asking not how should we award the street cleaning contract to, but rather asking how can we keep the streets clean. So policy suggestions include reassessing public procurement criteria in the light of the SDGs and the nature of work in the cultural economy, as well as incentivizing public officials, especially at the local level, to issue contracts that are accessible to local cultural and creative entrepreneurs, whether formal or informal, in ways that deliver wider community benefits in social, cultural, and environmental value. The third area is picking up on what Tita was talking about. She called it aggregators. We've spoken a lot about intermediaries, that those organizations that help provide an interface between freelance, subcontracted workers in the cultural economy and those who, and also government. Governments often find it very difficult to engage with the flexibility and agility that typifies our economy. Its fragmented nature, informal work, rapidly evolving skills and work methods. But all over the world now, there are intermediaries or aggregators that can act as negotiators, as interpreters between the state and the sector. And they can give formal status to otherwise informal workers. They can act as retail investors of banks or governments. They can support otherwise isolated workers and micros through mutual initiatives such as credit unions and co-working spaces. They can represent the needs of the sector to government, provide a lobbying opportunity. They can help protect and sustain IP protection, and they can also start measuring and documenting what goes on in the cultural economy. So finally, what is happening in our culture and creative economy points to wider changes in the global economy and the rise of the gig economy, casualized work as a standard feature of many neoliberal governments, and the huge changes made possible by digital technology and remote working, especially during the pandemic, coupled with the growth of megacities and their very informal communities, all suggest that the role of intermediaries can bring together social, cultural, economic, and environmental concerns in the ways that we're already seeing happening in the creative sector. And this can have wider application across society and allow government to engage in more creative and responsive ways with this whole sector and with all its citizens. So with those few remarks, I'll hand back to John. And thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Avril. So there's a little run through some of the points that we've tried to address in this 11-point agenda. And I'd say none of them are particularly revolutionary. They're all, in a sense, very obvious, common sense areas for government at local, national, and international level to address. But our idea was to pull these together to say, how do we develop a practical strategy for moving forward from the ambitions that we all have, that we all express for the creative and cultural sector into practical reality. In the same way that the COP26 conference in Glasgow a few weeks ago was talking about the need to move from commitments to action in climate change to action to really realize it. The same is true in this sector. And just in the closing minutes of the session that we have, I would just say two things. One is the International Council is made up of a variety of different expertises and different perspectives. So it's academics, it's investors, it's entrepreneurs, and it's policy professionals. And it's very, very global in its take. So the idea here was to pull together what could be a common agenda which would work around the world to push forward in a practical way on some of these agenda points. And now with Indonesia taking on the presidency of the G20 next year, what I'd like to do is just run around and ask the members of the panel that we have here, first of all, what do you think is the most significant element in our 11-point agenda? And I'm going to start with you first, Tita, if I may. If there was one thing that you think the Indonesian government should be pursuing as its top priority next year in a practical sense to drive forward this whole agenda, what would it be? And then I'll come around and ask all the others the same question, if I may.
Right, because, well, considering that there are three key words of G20 next year, the first is health, second is digital, and the third is energy. And we have to see where creative economy can be mainstreamed into one or more of these keywords to prove it, that actually creative economy is actually the solution because of the characteristics. And it's actually giving us an opportunity by presidency of the G20 next year that we can have a louder statement about the creative economy at the global south and how it is run and how it is measured and how it is implemented. And as you mentioned, the emphasis is always now at the action part and impact. So that's where actually, if for example we should use digital or we should go through the digital direction, then it should be actually accommodating everybody. So inclusivity is also important.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Laura, could I ask you the same couple of questions?
So John, government has a wonderful role to play to encourage investors to pay attention to the creative economy. And government can do that by providing technical assistance to the types of entrepreneurs that Avril was talking about and that Tita's been describing. Government can provide first loss capital or to de-risk opportunities. That can be in the form of tax credits. That can be through other sorts of particular schemes that make it more welcoming for investors seeking a market rate financial return to consider and participate in the creative economy. And we see that happening already in the United States. It's been happening for the last 40 years as part of our community development finance scheme. And so there are very practical ways that government can prime the pump to attract more impact investment capital into the creative economy, into existing businesses, to help entrepreneurs start up and grow businesses in the creative economy.
Thank you. And Avril, could I ask you the same questions?
Yeah, thanks, John. I mean, I will turn it a little bit on its head and say it's not only government that has to do a lot of new things, but even the private sector has a huge role to play here, as do non-governmental organizations. So for me, government's role should be in the enabling environment that provides the security and support, such as social protection, creative education at basic school level, ensuring there are programs at tertiary level for studying entrepreneurship and creative skills acquisition. But so the NGO sector could be involved in research and development, in acting as the intermediaries that I was speaking about, helping facilitate associations of workers, cultural workers in the sector. And the private sector has a role to play in entrepreneurship. They already have substantially and sophisticated programs on entrepreneurial support, on training and education, on digital knowledge and so on. They could be brought upon to pay more attention to this sector, which is one of the sectors that where multi-skilling, team working, creative thinking, imagination really is part and parcel of what the sector does. So for me, it's really a combination of government, NGOs, and the private sector.
Thanks, Avril. And Eliza, could I come to you last?
Yeah, I think during the beginning of the COVID pandemic, the International Council started meeting, I think, every couple of weeks, and it was basically a sort of community of support, people dealing with huge numbers of very troubling stories about what was happening to creative practitioners globally. And we actually just wanted to talk to each other about our experiences. One of the things that came up again and again was really disturbing stories about communities of craftspeople, of freelancers, people in the informal economy all over the world, without any adequate data to back it up. And I know from the UK experience that we actually had a government which was looking to support some parts of the economy, but couldn't get the data that it needed to be able to work out how those individuals needed support until it would have been too late. And so mistakes are inevitably going to be made. I think it's not exciting at all and very unfashionable to say you need to sort out your data. But I do think that one thing we could do globally is really change our approach to data when it comes to self-employed people. So we develop a really complex system of different types of employment, the type that we see in the world, the type that we communicate with each other when we talk, but which governments seem completely blind to because they don't have the numbers. That goes to the informal economy as well. So that is one thing that I think it would be amazing to make some big steps on next year.
I think if there's one thing that occurs to me, it's something that's come up at several points during the morning sessions here, and that is the incredible number of young people around the world who are already engaged in the creative industries, the enormous number of young people who would like to be engaged in the creative industries, and the fact that there is a rising crisis of youth unemployment. And bringing these things together, particularly at a time when the fourth industrial revolution is beginning to create all kinds of changes in the way the labor market works, opening up this sector as an area for young people to explore their own creativity, to express the creativity of their communities, and to find ways to make a living which is satisfying for them, is productive for their community, and is not damaging to the environment. That is a big triple win, which we should all be able to access. And I think thinking about how we drive forward opportunities for entrepreneurship and an education system which encourages young people to explore their creativity rather than bury it, which is what goes on in far too many education systems at the moment, that would be something well worth achieving. So we're pretty much out of time, but I ought to say that we owe a big thank you to the British Council, because the British Council has sponsored this session of the WCC event today, but also is the co-sponsor of the PEC International Council. And for those who don't know, the British Council really has been one of the kind of global pioneers in encouraging governments all around the world, particularly in countries like Colombia and Indonesia, I might say, to engage with the creative industries and creative industry policy over the last 15 years. So thanks to the British Council, but thanks most of all to WCCE for inviting us to present our 11-point agenda. I hope you'll have a look at it, have a read of it. I hope that you find it stimulating and useful, and I hope it provides something as a useful basis to build on for governments and civil society in the future in developing the next stage of the creative and cultural industry. So thank you all very much, and thanks my fellow panelists.